It is July. I'm very behind. I've been behind all year with filming, which is a good way to segue into the mid-year book tag. So this is a tag that was created by two people, both of whom I don't think make videos anymore, but I will leave their channels listed down below. And this is a tag that all booktubers do. You don't have to be tagged in this tag, but if you would like to be tagged, feel free to consider yourself tagged. Always feel free to answer any of these questions, some, all, any of these questions in the comments below. The mid-year tag, often called the mid-year book freakout tag, is a good tag to do in the middle of the year once we've passed the midpoint of the year to dive into how your reading has been going. For the last 2 years, I have been doing the notable quarter year tags, like the quarter year tag, the mid-year tag, the end of year tag, and any other tags that are about your overall reading, accompanied with talking about my stats and talking about my goals. So we will do that after I've answered the questions to this one. I have the questions. I have 14 questions. There's different variations of this tag out there. Some of them have more questions, some of them have less questions. Some people have changed the order of these tags. Some people have added questions. So I have a few that are added, and the first one is, how's your reading going so far this year? I think my reading's going really well. I am reading a lot, which one of my goals was to not read as much, which I don't think I'm actually succeeding at, but feeling pretty good about it. At the beginning of the year, I was feeling like I was reading too much, and then I took a couple of months where I read a little bit less, and now I feel myself kind of ramping up again to read more. And one of the things that I've realized about that is that, yes, I want to slow down my reading, because slowing down my reading means that maybe I absorb more and that I don't feel pressure to read a certain amount. But I've also realized that I like getting through books quickly, and I like reading a lot in a month or in a year because I like the action of reading. Getting up in the morning, reading a few books, spending a little time in the afternoon, listening to audiobooks, learning more about different authors, learning more about different places in the world, reading translated works, all the things that are like kind of wrapped up in my goal, and all the things that lead me to read more and more are things that I enjoy, that are things that are fun for me, relaxing for me. This has definitely become my main hobby, along with making YouTube videos. I don't watch a lot of television. I barely watch any movies. I watch YouTube, and that's about it. So reading for me is just like a relaxing, enjoyable pastime. Reading more just means that I get to read more of the things that I like, and I get to be actually reading more of my time, which is a relaxing pastime for me. Do you know what I'm saying? So I'm feeling less pressure on myself to not read more, to read less. I'm also feeling less bad about reading so much. But that being said, I'm also at a place where I'm still trying not to compare this month's reading to last month's reading, or how many books that I'm reading in a month, or how quickly I can get through books. I'm just reading at the pace that I'm reading at and not feeling stressed about it. So if I read 10 books in the month and that was feeling good, then that's great. If I read 16 books in the month or 20 books in the month, then that was where I was reading, and that feels great. So hopefully that'll continue for the rest of the year, and I will have kind of in the second half of the year a smoother time, and like less comparison to my former self, less comparison to where I think I should be, and more settling into where I actually am. The next question is also not on the original tags, and that's, how many books have you read so far this year? And I always do my video in July so that I can gather all my stats for the first 6 months of the year. So we're only talking about the first 6 months of the year in this video, and for the first 6 months of the year I read 92 books. So definitely not slowing down my reading. I've definitely read a lot of books so far this year and in the first half of the year, but I'm fine with that. I'm happy with where that is. Then question number 1 is, what is the best book that you've read so far this year? And I don't have a copy of it because I lent it out to my friend, but I think the best book, my favorite book, is Hereafter by Amy Lynn. This is a nonfiction book about Amy struggling with the sudden and unexpected death of her husband, and I just really loved that one. I thought it was really interestingly done and super fast-paced, super captivating, super propulsive, and I really loved the reading experience and I really loved the book. I won that one in a Goodreads giveaway, so I'm so happy that I did, and thank you to Goodreads and the publishers. I also really loved They. I read this much more recently in June, and I thought that was a great book. Just an interesting classic, modern classic, forgotten classic, republished classic, rediscovered classic. I thought that was atmospheric and thought-provoking and sci-fi, dark, all good. The next question is the best sequel that you've read this year, and I could go with a couple of things, but I'm going to choose Baby Cakes by Armistead Maupin because I was so happy to get back into the Tales of the City books and universe, and this is the first book in the series that I have not read previously before. So I read books 1 through 3 several times, and then I've never read this book, so I was super excited to read this. Tales of the City, if you don't know, is an awesome queer classic, modern classic, started in the 70s, but the most recent book has come out this year in 2024. So this is a very long-running queer series all about queer life in San Francisco and beyond, and the joys and the trials and the tribulations and the ups and downs, happiness of queer life. We really get to follow these characters through the years and see them on various adventures, see their loves, their losses, their tragedies, their joys. It's just such a fun series. Originally, it was actually serialized, so all the chapters are super, super short. We jump around perspective to perspective, but somehow still get a deep feel and connection with all the characters. So this was definitely my favorite sequel. I also did really love Last Devil to Die by Richard Osman. This could be an answer for a question coming up later as well, but I've just had so much fun with the Thursday Murder Club books. They are a series of books about octogenarians who form a cold case murder solving club that turns into a live case murder solving club, and it's a lot of fun, great characters, really interesting storylines, and just fun, fast-paced, silly, good time. I also read the sequel to Slippery Creatures, which is a male-male romance series. It's a historical fiction series set after World War I, and I really like that one. I think the second in the series was called The Sugared Game, and it was fun, again, to be back with Will Darling, his on-again, off-again love interest, and see the shenanigans and kind of espionage spy capers that they get up to. The next question is not on the original, but his favorite reread of the year. I think I've only reread 2 books this year. One of them was The Fire Next Time, which was amazing, and I read that on audio, and the audio narrator was awesome. It was Jesse L. Martin, who I love. Very handsome man, great voice, great reader for that particular book, great reread in general. But my favorite reread has to go to The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. I read this a few years ago, and it was my favorite book of the year that I originally read it, and I read this one on audio this year, and it was amazing. It was still amazing. I think about it all the time. I think about it so much, and it's crazy that I read it all the way back in like January, February, and I still am thinking about it, and I read it back in 2022, whenever that was that I originally read it, and I still think about it, but what a great book. Super looking forward to reading more of Stephen Graham Jones this year, I hope. The next question is new release you haven't read yet but want to, and question number 4, well, original question number 4 is most anticipated release for the second half of the year. So I don't follow new releases. I do read 2024 books. I do read new release books, but I don't follow them really. Like, I know there are books that have come out this year that I want to read. I know that there are books that are coming out this year in the second half of the year that I want to read, but I couldn't tell you what they were, and I'm just not that kind of booktuber. I'm mostly a backlist booktuber, and I'm mostly a person who gets excited about books, not because they're new, just because of the kind of books they are. So let me know in the comments below if you read any 2024 releases that you think I would like that have already come out, or if you are greatly anticipating one in the second half of the year. I think I left off with books you're anticipating. The next question is biggest surprise, and I think that is going to go to Mrs. Pollifax and the Hong Kong Mrs. Pollifax and the Hong Kong Buddha by Dorothy Gilman. This is one that I had in my basement box books and I pulled up just because it was interesting. I obviously got it at like a little free library or a book sale or something, and I'm sure that I got it because it talks about Mrs. Pollifax, the main character in this cozy mystery series, being from New Jersey. And I just really ended up liking this one. Like, it was a wild card as far as reading. Like, it just took my fancy and I decided to read it. But ever since then, I've been picking up more and more Mrs. Pollifax books. Mrs. Pollifax is a unassuming older woman in like her 60s or 70s, and she gets embroiled in the FBI and the CIA and starts taking on cases for those American detective agencies. This one, which is quite a bit later in the series, sees her going to Hong Kong to rescue a friend, or at least to look in on a friend that she had met on a previous case. These are just really fun, very short, written in the 80s, but they had that depth of storytelling that I find older cozy mysteries have. So they're not just talking about the cozy mystery plot, but they're also talking about bigger issues in the world or more interesting things, and I definitely see myself reading a lot more Mrs. Pollifax in the future. Another surprise, I think, would be Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone by Benjamin Stevenson. I wasn't initially interested in this one when I heard people talking about it, but I found it in a little free library and I decided to pick it up. I mean, I was interested in it, but like, I just didn't think it was going to be for me. And then I read the first couple of pages and I was like, I don't know about this. But I picked it up in June, I believe. Once I got into it, I was hooked and I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to reading the sequel and the Christmas special. Biggest disappointment, and I didn't grab a book for that. I think probably my biggest disappointment would just be my like lower rated, well, I mean, I don't rate books, but lower enjoyed books, like some of the cozy mysteries that I've read. I've also DNF'd quite a few books this year for me, which is not very many on the grand scheme of things, but for me it's kind of a lot. I think that those books were disappointments. Better not to dwell on those and better to talk about good books. Favorite new author, new to you, or debut? I think that has to go to Robin Sloan because I've already read 3 Robin Sloan books so far this year. The first book I read was Sourdough, and I really liked the kind of mix of fabulism and science fiction that's in this, like very, very light science fiction. This is about a woman who's kind of lost her way in San Francisco. She doesn't really know what to do with herself, and she starts making sourdough, which leads her on a larger adventure. And then Mr. Parumba's 24-Hour Bookstore is also about someone who has recently lost their job, doesn't know what to do, and stumbles upon a 24-hour bookstore in need of a bookstore clerk. I also read a short story that has to do with Mr. Penumbra, and there's one more short story that I have that I could read, or I have access to on Hoopla or Libby that I could read. And then Robin Sloan just came out with a new book in 2024 that I'm super excited about. So definitely considered a new favorite author. Surprising that it's a male author, but I really like the way that they write this kind of fabulism, fun adventure with found family and, you know, life lessons kind of at their heart. Very sweet, very nice, you know, like so many of the books that I read are about human cruelty, about human failings, about the inhumanity of our current society or our historical society. These are about like genuine goodness and connection with people, and I just really appreciate that. The next 2 questions are newest favorite character and newest fictional crush, and I really just don't think about books like that. Like, there are characters that I like, but like if you were like, name a character that's your favorite character, I can't think of any characters. And I definitely haven't had any crushes lately. I would say a relationship that I really liked, or a relationship that I was crushing on, was the relationship with Viola and the Duke in A Lady for a Duke. That was a really sweet relationship. And, you know, there's other characters that I really like and other relationships that I like, or people that I could like crush on. None like come to mind. Question number 10 is a book that made you cry, and so many books made me cry this year. Definitely The Last Devil to Die made me cry. A lot of books that I read made me cry. I cry pretty easily at books, but I will be putting out a video with all the books that I cried at during the year towards the end of this year, so look forward to that. But for this tag and for these purposes, let's say The Last Devil to Die. Book that made you happy this year. I mean, you could definitely say The Last Devil to Die for that one. You could definitely say Baby Cakes. You could definitely say the Robin Sloan books that I've read. You could definitely say Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone. You could say Mrs. Polifax. So like a lot of the books that I've been reading have made me happy this year. I've been reading a lot of fun, fast-paced. Like I just love that feeling of like wanting to read a book and getting caught up in it. So books that happens with make me happy this year, have made me happy this year. But overall, I don't read like a lot of super happy books. I guess I have read a few more happy books this year than other years, but overall I don't usually read a lot of happy books, but it's more the feeling of books that made me happy, the experience of books that make me happy. It's more of just getting engrossed and engaged in a book that makes me happy. The next question is most beautiful book you've bought so far this year or received. I've bought a lot of books this year. I only ever buy used books. I did buy one new book this year, so that's interesting. So far, anyway. Instead of talking about the books that I've bought and the beautiful books that I've bought, there have been many. Lots of books that I bought are beautiful, but they are on my TBR shelf. None of them stand out immediately in my mind. So I'm going to talk about books that I've read this year that are beautiful. I think probably one of the most beautiful covers ever is Sorrow Land by River Solomon. This is just so lovely. I love the monochromatic style of it. I love the thin lines. I'm a big thin line drawing person. This would be a great tattoo, actually, talking about that. I love the font. I love the way there's a lot of like negative space. Now, this is a proof, so I don't know if this is what the final cover looks like, but I think this is a really beautiful book. I also think Diary of a Void is a really beautiful book. I love the kind of obvious representation of a human and obvious realistic representation, but that it's kind of cartoony. I also love the layout of it and how the title is in the middle and that it covers the woman's stomach, and the idea of a pregnant woman's stomach or a baby inside a stomach is implied, and then also that the title is in the stomach area is implied, and the title of the void. So I think this is really gorgeous as well. The last question is, what books do you need to read by the end of the year? So I think I always answer basically the same thing to this, which is I need to read the book challenges that I join over the year for the end of the year. I'm behind on all of those. I always join the Savage Prompts, and I think I've only read 2 books from the Savage Prompts this year so far, so I really need to read some more of those. I am super behind on TBR Spin. It is July as I'm filming this, and I think I'm still reading the June book. So I guess I'm not that far behind, but I need to catch up on TBR Spin. I like to do Books and Lalas, Buzzword Readathon, but I like to do that at the end of the year and then just read the books that I haven't read yet. Like I see what books I've read through the year could fit into what prompts, and then I read them at the end. I wanted to do Ben Read Good challenge, and I did read some books for that, but I haven't read all of them. Rick McDonnell was supposed to do BookTube Spin this year, and he didn't, but there's just lots of those kind of things that I like. Oh, of course, my own personal challenges, which I have been making progress on, which are my 20 books I found out about in 2020, 21 books I found about in 2021, 22 books I found about in 2022 list, as well as my summer TBR and my end of year TBR from last year and my 24 in 24. So those were 24 books that I bought in 2023 that I wanted to read in 2024 or brought into my library, you know what I mean. So all those are books that I need to read by the end of the year. And then of course, you know, anything else I want to read as well. So those are all the questions for the mid-year book freakout tag. And like I said, consider yourself tags. Feel free to answer one or any or all of the questions in the comments below. And then let's move over to my office and my library and talk about my stats for the year a little bit. So every tag like this that has like a quarter year, so we have the quarter year tag, sometimes called the quarter year crisis tag. We have the mid-year tag, sometimes called the mid-year freakout tag. We have the end of year tag, which actually happens in the fall for the end of the year. And then we have the postscript tag, which starts the beginning of the next year talking about what happened throughout the year. So it could be October, November, December, or you can go ahead and talk about the whole rest of the year. So what I've been doing with these tags for the last few years is I've been talking about the quarter in these tags. We are just finished quarter 2, and in quarter 2, according to my calculations, I read 42 books. I keep my own spreadsheets for certain things, my own graphs for certain things that I want to keep track of, and then I also have Storygraph and Goodreads to refer back to as well. So according to my calculations, I read 42 books in the second quarter. That is down from the first quarter, which goes along with my goal of reading less books this year and less books in general. So we're just talking about books for April, May, and June, and things that I tracked are new to me authors or read before. Apparently I read 29 new to me authors in quarter 2 and only 13 that I've read before. I guess that makes sense. I have been reading a lot of like one-offs. I have read a bunch of authors that I just found randomly, like some poetry that I just found randomly. And then I also have read quite a few books that were on my want to read list. Next is BIPOC authors, so Black, Indigenous, person of color, Asian authors versus white authors. I didn't do so great in this. My goal is always to read at least 50% BIPOC authors in my reading, just in general. But according to my charts, I read 57.1% white authors and 42.9% BIPOC authors, so that is 18 person of color authors. So that is not ideal. I did read a lot of authors from like different countries that are not necessarily person of color authors. Hopefully I can get that back up. I know right off the bat that July is not going to be good for those stats, but hopefully we can continue to work on that goal and make progress in that goal. Another goal that I have is to read at least 25% queer authors or queer stories. So I count queer stories not necessarily told by queer authors in this because I want to see that representation even if it is written by non-queer authors. I did really good in this stat this quarter. I read 45.5% queer stories, and that is 17 queer books out of the quarter, out of those 42 books, and then 59.5% non-queer. I do track my fiction to nonfiction, but I don't ever make a goal of this. Similar to the read before or new to me authors, I like to see what those stats are, but they're not really important to me. If I read nonfiction when I want to read nonfiction, I love nonfiction. I don't feel like I'm reading too little or too much nonfiction, no matter how much I've read. The stats are that I read 81% fiction books and 19% nonfiction. That's only 8 nonfiction out of those 42, but that's fine. A lot of those I think were poetry books in the second quarter, although again I did read some memoirs. Another goal that I have is translated work, so I am trying to read at least 25% of my overall reading this year as translated work, and I have not accomplished that this quarter, but I am edging my way up, eking my way up. What was it for quarter 1? For quarter 1 it was only 14%, and in quarter 2 2022, I read 19% translated work. So it's becoming easier to read translated work. It's becoming more ingrained in my reading to read translated work. That means that I read 8 translated work and 34 in the original English. And translated could be translated from any language into English because English is the language that I read in. On Storygraph, there is a challenge to read a book from every country, and I do try to list all the books in there. So that's a really fun challenge if you want to join it. Something that I do like to keep track of is male, female, or trans and non-binary authors. This is something that, although I keep track of, I don't really do a lot of digging. This is just if the gender of the author is apparent, if it's part of their press release identity, fine. Some of these authors could be non-binary and I don't know about it. But for this pie chart, I did better than last quarter. I think I only read 1 not trans or non-binary author last quarter. And in this quarter, I read 4 trans or non-binary authors. I read 55.8% female authors, which is 24 books. And then I read 34.9% male authors, which is 15. And then those 4 trans or non-binary authors equates to 9.3%. And then this is one of my favorite things to track, and that is my owned books versus unowned books, audio unowned books, or other. I have been keeping track of the books that come into my house every year since 2022. So I have a spreadsheet, a RAB, recently acquired book spreadsheet that has all of that information, and I like to see how many books in the quarter I've read that I acquired in 2024, so this year, the present year, that I've acquired before 2024. I like to see how many audiobooks I've read in the quarter that were unowned. So the owned 2024 or owned pre-2024 could be audiobooks, could be dual audiobooks and physical, but audiobooks alone that I do not own are its own category, and then other is its own category. So that could be books that I got from the library, or books that a friend lent me, or something that I read digitally, which happens very, very rarely. For my owned books, 2024, books that I acquired this year that I read in the quarter, I read 10 books that I've acquired this year, and that is 23.8%. And then my pre-2024, so anything on my shelves or my RAB spreadsheet that I got before this year, I read 16. Now, this is not a great stat, which is I read 15 unowned audiobooks. So I am trying to get down my physical TBR, so I do try to read audiobooks that I do also own physically, but that didn't really happen in this quarter because I read 15 unowned audiobooks. But I did read a lot of good audiobooks, and definitely Libby and Hoopla have skewed this stat a little bit because I do love getting books from the library, and I do love having access to books that I don't own. And then I did read 1 other book, and I'm not sure what that was. I feel like it might have been Invisible Cities, which was a book that was lent to me. But overall, this pie chart looks very nice. It doesn't look terrible, except I would love to see the blue audio unowned be less and the owned taking up more of that pie chart, but it looks pretty good. So those were my personal stats that I keep. Let's really quick just look at Storygraph. I don't like that on Storygraph, the non-paid version, you can't see, if you don't do it before you start reading books in the next quarter, you're not going to see it. But I think it's pretty safe to say that my most read genre, according to Storygraph, was mystery, and then LGBTQIA+. This is for the first 2 quarters. Literary, sure. Horror, sure. Historical, okay. On my own personal tags, again, new to me, queer, a lot of books that I teared up about, a lot of books that I cried about. You can see on this chart from Storygraph that I have read more books on audio than I have in print, which is a little bit troubling. And you can see that I read 14 books in April, 13 books in May, 15 books in June, and that is 3,074 pages in April, 3,053 pages in May, and 3,121 pages in June. Interesting charts, interesting things. Let me know if you keep charts and graphs of your quarterly reading or your yearly reading? Do you like to look at them at the quarter? I do. I think it's interesting, especially for some of those goals that I really want to meet, like reading queer books, like reading BIPOC authors, like reading translated works. Those are like the ones that are kind of the most important to me, but I do find like how many nonfiction I've read in a quarter and how many new to me authors I've read in a quarter an interesting stat to look at well. So let me know if you keep track of those kind of things. Let me know what some of your goals for the year are and if you're doing well on them. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.